Betrayed and broken, she vowed to make them all pay. Her name was Charlotte Reed. She was 27 years old. Raised in the quiet English town of Ashford, she had always been the diligent, reliable one. Her family was modest but proud, and Charlotte worked tirelessly at a local marketing firm, hoping to climb the ladder and prove her worth. Yet, beneath the surface of her polite smile was a girl who had learned early on that ambition often came at a cost, especially when surrounded by those who wielded power not with fairness, but with cruelty and deceit. The tension at work was palpable. Charlotte's ideas were often dismissed, her efforts overlooked, and her loyalty exploited. Unknown to her, these quiet injustices were setting the stage for a reckoning far beyond office politics. The day everything changed began like any other, with Charlotte arriving early, clutching her usual cup of tea. The office buzzed with whispered gossip, eyes darting furtively as her manager, Greg Harrison, called a sudden meeting. Greg was a polished man, always impeccably dressed, with a charm that veiled a ruthless streak. That morning, he announced a major promotion opportunity, one Charlotte had been quietly working toward for years. But instead of her name, it was given to someone new, a recently hired junior, Olivia Clark, whose only merit seemed to be her connection to a senior board member. Charlotte's heart sank as laughter and smirks echoed around the room, the entire department made complicit in the humiliation. The weeks leading up to the promotion decision had been a torment Charlotte barely endured. Every suggestion she made was met with condescension or outright dismissal. Olivia, with her privileged background and smug confidence, was given tasks that Charlotte had dreamed of handling. At the office Christmas party, the final blow was dealt, not in private, but in front of everyone. Greg toasted Olivia's fresh ideas and promising future, leaving Charlotte invisible, her years of dedication erased in a cruel blink. Mocked by colleagues who once feigned friendship, Charlotte felt the sting of betrayal deep in her bones. The injustice was not just professional, it was personal, a deliberate erasure of her worth. The breaking point came on a dreary Thursday afternoon. Charlotte was asked to prepare a presentation for a high-profile client, a task she took seriously, hoping to prove her value once and for all. But as she stood before the board, Olivia was handed the floor, her speech peppered with Charlotte's meticulously researched statistics and ideas. The room applauded Olivia's insight, while Charlotte's face burned with humiliation. She was dismissed afterward with a curt, "Good try," the words dripping with condescension. It was clear she was being pushed out, her contributions stolen, and her voice silenced. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected, igniting a fire she could no longer contain. As the meeting ended and Charlotte retreated to her desk, the weight of the moment crushed her. She felt shock, numbness, then a rising tide of anger. How had it come to this? The years of loyalty, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, it all amounted to betrayal and mockery. But beneath the pain, a quiet resolve began to form. She would not let this injustice define her. This wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about exposing the hypocrisy of those who thrived by stepping on others. Her revenge would be patient, calculated, and merciless. Charlotte's mind raced, plotting a comeback that no one would see coming. Days later, while clearing out old files, Charlotte stumbled upon an email thread that could change everything. It revealed Greg's manipulation, bribing a consultant to undermine her projects and promote Olivia unfairly. The evidence was damning, a clear violation of company ethics and possibly the law. This discovery shifted the power dynamic completely. Charlotte now held a weapon far stronger than any presentation or office gossip, a secret that could bring Greg and Olivia crashing down. The seed of revenge was no longer just a thought. It was a plan armed with truth and justice. Armed with the evidence, Charlotte began to quietly gather allies. She reached out to colleagues who had suffered under Greg's reign, building a network of support. The office atmosphere shifted subtly as whispers of Greg's misconduct began to circulate. Charlotte's calm demeanor masked the storm brewing beneath. This was no longer a personal vendetta. It was a crusade to expose corruption and hypocrisy. With every discreet move, she tightened the noose around those who had humiliated her. The tables were turning, and the taste of impending justice fueled her resolve. The tension escalated rapidly. At a crucial board meeting, Charlotte presented her findings with unshakable poise, the room falling silent as the evidence unfolded. Greg's confident facade cracked, and Olivia's smugness faded into panic. The hypocrisy of their actions was laid bare, their carefully constructed worlds crumbling under the weight of Charlotte's quiet retaliation. Emotions ran high, alliances shifted, and the office became a battlefield where truth wielded the ultimate power. Charlotte stood tall, no longer the betrayed employee, but the avenger who had reclaimed her dignity and shattered the silence. As the meeting concluded, the consequences loomed large but remained unspoken. Charlotte's heart pounded with anticipation and dread. She had delivered justice, but the aftermath was uncertain. Would the company punish the corrupt, or would they bury the scandal to protect their image? Her revenge was not just about ruin, but about reclaiming her voice and forcing accountability. The final moment before the fallout was charged with unrelenting tension, a promise that no one involved would ever forget the reckoning Charlotte had unleashed. The question hung in the air, was this the end, or just the beginning? Charlotte's world had shifted overnight, but the sting of betrayal still clung to her skin like a cold shadow. The morning after the promotion announcement, she found herself walking the streets of Ashford with a hollow ache in her chest. The familiar cobbled lanes and quiet cafes seemed suddenly alien, their charm overshadowed by the memory of last night's humiliation. At the office, the whispers had started, half mocking, half sympathetic, but no one dared confront Greg Harrison directly. Charlotte's colleagues, once friendly, now viewed her with a mix of pity and wariness. Some even sided openly with Olivia Clark, whose polished smile masked the privilege that had vaulted her ahead. Charlotte had always believed in merit and hard work. She had sacrificed weekends, missed family dinners, and stayed late countless nights, all for the hope of recognition. Instead, she was sidelined, her ideas dismissed as naive or irrelevant. Olivia, with her effortless charm and connections, had been handed everything on a silver platter. It was more than unfair. It was a deliberate erasure of Charlotte's efforts. The injustice felt personal, an insult not only to her career, but to her very identity. The quiet office environment had become a battleground where her voice was systematically silenced. At the weekly team meeting, Greg made sure to undermine Charlotte further. He brushed off her suggestions with a condescending smile, praising Olivia's fresh perspective while casting Charlotte as the overly cautious one. The room echoed with laughter as Greg joked about Charlotte's old-fashioned ideas, turning her into the office fool. Charlotte clenched her fists beneath the table, her cheeks burning with shame. This wasn't just professional dismissal, it was public humiliation, broadcast for all to see. Yet, no one intervened. Some even joined in, eager to curry favor with Greg and Olivia. That evening, Charlotte sat alone in her tiny flat, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She replayed every moment, every snide remark, every dismissive glance. The betrayal cut deep, especially because it came from people she had trusted, Greg, who had once mentored her, and colleagues who had shared her dreams. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the ground beneath her had crumbled. But beneath the pain, a spark of defiance flickered. This was not how her story would end. She refused to be the office scapegoat or the forgotten worker bee. The humiliation was a wound, but also a catalyst, a reason to fight back, quietly but decisively. The following days were a blur of forced smiles and grinding teeth. Charlotte threw herself into work with renewed determination, but this time with a secret weapon: observation. She watched Greg's movements, listened closely to office gossip, and discreetly noted inconsistencies in decisions. Her patience was no longer born of hope, but of calculation. She began documenting everything: the emails, the meetings, the suspicious approvals. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive transformed into a methodical hunt for leverage. Every slight was fuel, every insult an incentive to uncover the truth hiding beneath the surface. Then one afternoon, as Charlotte was sorting through archived project files, she stumbled upon a series of emails that made her pulse quicken. The messages weren't just petty office banter, they revealed payments to an external consultant, laced with instructions to undermine her work and elevate Olivia's profile. The sums discussed were substantial, far beyond what was reasonable for consultancy fees. Thousands of pounds that smelled of bribery and corruption. This was the smoking gun Charlotte had needed, a breach of trust that could topple Greg's carefully maintained empire. The discovery was intoxicating, a sudden shift from powerless victim to potential avenger. For the first time since the downfall, Charlotte felt a surge of hope. The knowledge gave her a new kind of strength, moral clarity, and strategic advantage. She knew the path ahead would be dangerous, that Greg and Olivia would fight back fiercely. But she also knew she was no longer alone. She had evidence, and with it, a chance to expose the lies that had destroyed her. Quietly, she began planning, reaching out to trusted colleagues one by one, testing the waters, gauging loyalty. The atmosphere in the office was changing. Beneath the surface, a storm was gathering, and Charlotte was at its center, ready to unleash the justice she so desperately craved. Charlotte's days became a careful balance between outward composure and inward plotting. With the damning emails in her possession, she moved like a shadow through the office corridors, sharing her findings only with those she could trust implicitly. Each whispered conversation was a step toward dismantling the facade Greg had so meticulously built. The people she approached were those who had suffered under his manipulations, quiet victims who had lost promotions, had their ideas stolen, or were pushed aside with thinly veiled cruelty. Together, they formed a fragile alliance, united by a shared desire for justice that Charlotte now embodied. Despite the growing tension, Charlotte maintained the appearance of the wronged but docile employee. She smiled politely when Greg passed by, nodded at Olivia's smug greetings, and kept her voice low during meetings. But beneath the surface, her mind was sharpening, every interaction catalogued and analyzed. She had learned that revenge was not about reckless outbursts, but about quiet, calculated strikes. Greg's arrogance was his weakness. He believed himself untouchable, surrounded by loyalists and blinded by his own greed. Charlotte intended to use that arrogance against him. One afternoon, the office buzzed with news of an upcoming audit, an external review of the company's financial dealings and internal procedures. It was the perfect opportunity. Charlotte saw a chance to slip the incriminating emails into the hands of the auditors, ensuring that the corruption would be exposed beyond the confines of office gossip. But to do so, she needed to access secure files and bypass Greg's control of the company's digital records. It was risky, but the stakes were clear. Either she risked everything to expose the truth or allowed the injustice to fester unchecked. As the audit approached, Charlotte intensified her surveillance. She spent evenings at her desk after hours, quietly copying documents and preparing a comprehensive dossier that would leave no room for denial. Olivia continued her charade, basking in newfound promotions and invitations to exclusive events, oblivious to the storm gathering behind closed doors. Greg, meanwhile, grew increasingly erratic, sensing the shifting winds but unable to pinpoint their source. His dismissive sneers turned into nervous glances, and the once unshakable leader began to falter under Charlotte's silent pressure. The tension in the office was palpable on the day the auditors arrived. Charlotte wore a mask of calm professionalism, greeting the strangers with polite efficiency while internally counting the minutes. The auditors were thorough, digging deep into financial records and contracts, their questions probing areas Greg had hoped to keep hidden. Charlotte's heart raced as she handed over her dossier discreetly, watching as the auditors' expressions shifted from curiosity to grim understanding. It was happening. Justice was no longer a distant dream but an imminent reality. That evening, the office was a fragile silence, the usual chatter replaced by hushed speculation. Greg avoided Charlotte's gaze, his confidence shattered. Olivia's usual smirk was gone, replaced by a nervous edge. Charlotte, however, felt a quiet victory settle over her. She had survived the humiliation, endured the betrayal, and now held the power to bring the corrupt down. Yet she remained cautious, knowing that the final battle was still ahead. The audit's findings would determine everything, and until the verdict was out, the future hung in precarious balance. But one thing was certain: Charlotte was no longer the victim. She was the force to be reckoned with. The moment of reckoning arrived suddenly, like a thunderclap in the quiet halls of Ashford Marketing. The auditors called an emergency meeting with the company's board, and Charlotte was summoned to attend. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Whispers filled the room as staff exchanged uneasy glances. Greg Harrison entered with his usual forced confidence, but the cracks in his facade were unmistakable. Olivia followed behind, her usual poise replaced by a nervous tightness in her smile. Charlotte stood at the edge of the room, feeling the weight of every eye, some filled with curiosity, others with thinly veiled hostility. The lead auditor began presenting the findings, each word a hammer blow. The illicit payments, the fabricated reports, the deliberate sabotage of Charlotte's projects, all laid bare in meticulous detail. Greg's face paled as the evidence was read aloud, his attempts to interrupt met with firm refusal. Olivia fidgeted, her earlier arrogance dissipating as the truth unraveled. The board members, once Greg's loyal supporters, exchanged uneasy looks, their silence speaking volumes. Charlotte watched quietly, her heart pounding not with fear, but with vindication. After months of being dismissed and demeaned, the scales of justice were finally tipping in her favor. As the meeting progressed, Greg attempted to deflect blame, painting himself as a victim of circumstance and casting doubt on the authenticity of the emails. But Charlotte had anticipated this. She calmly presented a timeline of events, supported by witnesses from her growing alliance of colleagues, whose testimonies corroborated the corruption. The room grew colder for Greg with every word, his web of lies unraveling. Olivia, caught in the crossfire, was exposed not just as an accomplice but as someone who had willingly embraced deceit for personal gain. Charlotte's quiet strength was undeniable, a stark contrast to the crumbling empire around her. When the board adjourned to deliberate, the silence that followed was heavy with expectation. Charlotte's mind raced, replaying every moment, every insult, every betrayal that had led her here. She thought of the long nights, the stolen credit, the whispered mockery. But more than that, she felt a deep sense of justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered under Greg's reign. This was more than personal revenge. It was a reckoning for a corrupt system that rewarded cunning over merit. And she had broken through that system with nothing but truth and resilience. Hours later, the board returned with their verdict. Greg was to be suspended pending a full investigation, and Olivia was stripped of her recent promotion with a recommendation for dismissal. The company promised sweeping reforms, a commitment to transparency, and a renewed focus on fairness. The room erupted in a mixture of relief and disbelief. Charlotte's colleagues approached her cautiously, some apologizing for their earlier complicity, others expressing newfound respect. Yet, amidst the clamor, Charlotte remained composed, her gaze steady. She had won the battle, but the war against hypocrisy and injustice was far from over. As the meeting dispersed, Greg shot Charlotte one last venomous look, his silence louder than any threat. Olivia avoided her eyes entirely, her fall from grace complete. Charlotte felt a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion settle over her. She had faced humiliation and betrayal, endured the worst of office politics, and emerged not only unbroken, but victorious. But beneath the surface, a quiet question lingered. What would come next? The taste of revenge was sweet, but the path ahead promised new challenges. For now, though, Charlotte allowed herself a moment of victory, knowing the fight for justice had only just begun. Charlotte's days following the board's decision were filled with an uneasy calm. The office, once a suffocating cage of whispered insults and covert glances, felt different, charged with a new energy, as if a long-held secret had been ripped open, and everyone was trying to figure out where they stood. Some colleagues approached her with genuine apologies, others with cautious curiosity, but many remained silent, unwilling or afraid to confront the shifting power dynamic. Despite the victory, Charlotte felt the weight of loneliness settle heavily on her shoulders. Justice had been served, But the wounds from betrayal and disrespect ran deeper than any official ruling could heal. Greg Harrison's suspension sent shockwaves through the company. His departure left a vacuum of authority, and Olivia's demotion sent her spiraling into a quiet desperation. Yet neither Greg nor Olivia showed any sign of genuine remorse. Instead, their anger simmered beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. Charlotte knew this well. The battlefield had changed, but the war was far from over. She had to remain vigilant, protect herself from their inevitable retaliation. The very people who had humiliated her once now saw her as a threat, and that threat had to be neutralized if they were to survive the fallout. In the quiet moments between meetings, Charlotte reflected on the personal cost of her revenge. Her relationships outside work had frayed. Friends who once called her regularly had become distant, unsure how to navigate the storm she had stirred. She had sacrificed comfort and companionship for the sake of exposing a truth that others preferred to ignore. The loneliness was a heavy price, but Charlotte's resolve remained unshaken. She understood now that revenge was not a destination, but a journey. A long, often painful path toward reclaiming one's dignity and voice in a world that sought to silence it. One evening, as Charlotte sat in her flat reviewing documents, her phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. Mark Sullivan, a former colleague who had been quietly supportive during the upheaval. He warned her that Greg was attempting to gather allies outside the company, hinting at plans to discredit Charlotte and undermine the audit's findings. The news was a stark reminder that the fight extended beyond office walls. Greg's reach was long, and his desire for revenge fierce. Charlotte's heart pounded, but she welcomed the challenge. It was a test of her newfound strength and a call to sharpen her tactics even further. Rather than retreat, Charlotte decided to confront the threat head-on. She began gathering more evidence, this time focusing on Greg's attempts to manipulate external parties, emails, phone records, and witness statements that painted a damning picture of his desperation. She shared this information discreetly with company lawyers and trusted contacts, ensuring that any attempt to smear her would be met with swift counteraction. The quiet retaliation had become a strategic campaign, one that required patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. Charlotte had learned to wield silence as a weapon, turning the tables on those who had once sought to bury her. As weeks passed, the tension in Ashford marketing remained palpable. Greg's efforts to rally support outside faltered under the weight of Charlotte's evidence. Olivia, stripped of her privileges, became increasingly isolated, her confidence shattered. Meanwhile, Charlotte's reputation transformed, from the dismissed employee to a symbol of resilience and justice. Colleagues who had once ignored her now sought her counsel, recognizing the strength it took to stand alone and fight. Yet, despite the growing respect, Charlotte remained guarded, aware that the final act of this drama was still to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide not just her future, but the soul of the company itself. In the solitude of her small Ashford flat, Charlotte often found herself wrestling with the storm inside her mind. The humiliation she had endured, the public dismissals, the stolen credit, the cold betrayals had left scars deeper than anyone at the office could see. Each memory was a jagged shard, sharp and unrelenting, but it was this pain that fueled her quiet determination. She no longer saw herself as the powerless woman crushed beneath Greg's arrogance or Olivia's smugness. Instead, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a force of reckoning, shaped by betrayal, but driven by the pursuit of justice. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment she'd realized the depth of Greg's deceit, the emails, the bribery, the manipulation. It had been like waking from a nightmare, the world suddenly clearer yet more treacherous. The betrayal was not a singular act but a pattern, a systemic rot that had eroded the very foundations of the company she had once believed in. The sting of being used as a pawn in their game was bitter, but it had also ignited a fire she could not extinguish. Charlotte understood now that revenge was not about spectacle or noise, it was about patience, precision, and the quiet unraveling of those who had wronged her. She questioned herself often. Was she becoming what she despised? Was this thirst for vengeance worth the loneliness, the sleepless nights, the constant looking over her shoulder? Yet, every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the faces, the colleagues who had suffered in silence, the friends who had turned away, the casual cruelty that had become her daily reality. This was not merely personal, it was a stand against hypocrisy and injustice. Charlotte's resolve hardened. She would expose them all, not with rage, but with the cold clarity of truth. In moments of rare vulnerability, Charlotte allowed herself to imagine a future beyond this battle, a future where her name was no longer whispered in pity or scorn, but spoken with respect. She dreamed of rebuilding her life on her own terms, free from the shadows cast by Greg's manipulations. But she also knew that before that future could exist, the past had to be confronted and dismantled. The justice she sought was not just for herself, but for the integrity of every honest worker crushed under deceit. This thought gave her strength when exhaustion threatened to consume her. As the days wore on, Charlotte's internal resolve found expression in her actions. She meticulously documented every piece of evidence against Greg and Olivia, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Her network of allies within the company grew, emboldened by her courage and clarity. Yet, she remained cautious, knowing that Greg's desperation made him unpredictable and dangerous. The quiet war she waged was as much about self-preservation as it was about retribution. Charlotte had become a master of patience, understanding that revenge, like justice, was a slow-burning flame that demanded careful tending. Beneath the surface of her calm exterior, a storm brewed, a potent mix of pain, anger, and hope. Charlotte Reed was no longer the woman who had arrived in Ashford with nothing but dreams and determination. She was a survivor, a strategist, and soon, she vowed, she would be a victor. The final act of this long, bruising play was drawing near, and when it came, it would be impossible to ignore. The quiet whispers of the past would give way to the undeniable roar of her comeback, a reckoning that would leave no room for doubt or denial. One chilly afternoon, as Charlotte was reviewing her carefully compiled dossier in the quiet corner of a local cafe, an unexpected message arrived that would change everything. It was from a whistleblower. Thomas Graves, a mid-level accountant who had worked closely with Greg for years but had remained silent out of fear. His message was brief yet explosive. He had uncovered evidence of far deeper corruption within the company, something that Greg had gone to great lengths to conceal. Thomas offered to meet Charlotte in secret, promising documents that could not only destroy Greg, but also implicate powerful figures on the company's board who had enabled the corruption to flourish. Charlotte's heart pounded as she absorbed the weight of the message. This was the twist she hadn't dared hope for, a revelation that could shatter the entire corrupt hierarchy and give her the leverage she needed to ensure lasting change. The risk was enormous. Trusting Thomas meant exposing herself further, stepping into unknown dangers beyond the office walls. Yet, the opportunity to expose the hypocrisy and injustice on a larger scale was too vital to ignore. With a cautious resolve, Charlotte arranged the meeting, knowing that this unexpected ally could be the key to turning the tide irrevocably in her favor. The meeting took place in a secluded park just outside Ashford, under the dim light of a late afternoon sky. Thomas arrived nervously, clutching a worn briefcase filled with confidential files, emails, contracts, and financial records that painted a damning picture of systematic bribery, embezzlement, and manipulation reaching far beyond what Charlotte had uncovered. As he spoke, his voice low and urgent, Charlotte realized the corruption was not just the work of Greg, but a network of complicity involving board members who had turned a blind eye in exchange for personal gain. The hypocrisy ran deep, and the stakes had escalated beyond anything she had imagined. Armed with this new evidence, Charlotte felt a surge of strength. This was no longer a personal vendetta, but a crusade to dismantle a corrupt empire from within. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically. She now held not just proof of Greg's misdeeds, but the means to expose an entire system built on lies and exploitation. The discovery filled her with a fierce clarity, a moral advantage that transcended revenge. It was justice in its most righteous form, and Charlotte was determined to wield it with unyielding precision. The quiet woman who had been humiliated and betrayed was now a force to be reckoned with. Returning from the meeting, Charlotte's mind raced with possibilities. She knew that revealing this evidence would provoke fierce backlash, but it also meant that those who had underestimated her would be powerless to stop what was coming. She began crafting a plan to bring the information to light strategically, ensuring the maximum impact. She reached out to her trusted allies within the company and contacted a respected investigative journalist known for exposing corporate scandals. Every move was calculated, every step measured. Charlotte was no longer reacting. She was orchestrating a reckoning that would echo far beyond Ashford. The days that followed were a tense dance of secrecy and strategy. Charlotte balanced her routine work with covert preparations, knowing that one wrong move could jeopardize everything she had fought for. Greg and his allies sensed the shifting power, but remained blind to the full extent of the danger. Olivia, increasingly isolated, was reduced to desperate attempts to salvage her reputation. Meanwhile, Charlotte's inner resolve grew stronger, fueled by the knowledge that she now held the key to dismantling the empire that had once tried to crush her. The quiet retaliation was evolving into a storm that no one could ignore. With the weight of Thomas's revelations pressing heavily on her, Charlotte moved swiftly but cautiously. She understood that exposing such deep-rooted corruption would not be a simple matter of presenting evidence and expecting justice to follow. The powerful figures implicated had far-reaching influence and would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Yet Charlotte's resolve was unshakable. Armed with painstakingly gathered documents and the support of a trusted investigative journalist, she began to weave a narrative impossible to ignore. A story that laid bare the greed, hypocrisy, and betrayal festering beneath Ashford Marketing's polished surface. The journalist, Eleanor Price, was a seasoned professional known for her integrity and tenacity. After reviewing Charlotte's dossier and corroborating the evidence, Eleanor agreed to publish an exclusive exposé. The article promised to shake the corporate world, revealing not only Greg Harrison's manipulations, but also the complicity of board members who had turned a blind eye to scandal in exchange for personal gain. Charlotte watched as Eleanor's words took shape, carefully crafted, backed by irrefutable proof, and laced with a quiet but powerful call for accountability. This was more than revenge. It was a demand for justice that the company could no longer evade. As the publication date approached, tension within Ashford Marketing reached a boiling point. Employees whispered anxiously in corridors, rumors swirling like wildfire. Greg's supporters scrambled to discredit Charlotte, painting her as a disgruntled employee seeking vengeance, but their efforts fell flat against the mounting evidence. Olivia's presence became a liability, her every action scrutinized, her excuses thin and unconvincing. Meanwhile, Charlotte remained outwardly composed, her quiet confidence growing with each passing day. She had learned that true power lay not in loud declarations, but in the steady, relentless pursuit of truth. When the exposé finally broke, it was like a bomb detonating in the heart of the company. Headlines screamed of embezzlement, bribery, and systemic corruption. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Share prices plummeted, clients withdrew their business, and regulatory bodies launched formal investigations. Charlotte watched from the sidelines as the empire Greg had built crumbled spectacularly, the hypocrisy of its leaders laid bare for all to see. The office that had once been a place of humiliation for her became a stage for reckoning, where the corrupt were forced to answer for their sins. Yet, even as the fallout unfolded, Charlotte remained vigilant. She knew that those who wielded power rarely surrendered it without a fight. Greg and his allies were mounting a desperate counterattack, using every resource to undermine the investigation and discredit her. Anonymous threats arrived, subtle warnings delivered through veiled conversations and social media rumors. But Charlotte's resolve only hardened. She had come too far to be silenced now. The quiet retaliation had become a roar, unstoppable and fierce, promising not just personal vindication but the restoration of justice and integrity. The climax of her long journey was near, and nothing would stand in her way. The days that followed the exposé's release were a whirlwind of chaos and confrontation. Ashford Marketing, once a respected company, was now engulfed in scandal, its very foundations shaking beneath the weight of Charlotte's revelations. The boardroom was a battleground of accusations, denials, and desperate attempts to salvage reputations. Greg Harrison, stripped of his usual arrogance, fought to maintain his grip, but the evidence was overwhelming. The company's clients, once loyal, turned their backs, and regulatory authorities moved quickly to investigate every corner of the operation. Charlotte watched as the empire that had humiliated her crumbled piece by piece, the hypocrisy exposed in brutal clarity. The emotional intensity of the moment was overwhelming. Charlotte felt a surge of vindication mingled with exhaustion. Every insult, every betrayal she had suffered, the stolen promotions, the mocking laughter, the cold dismissals, now fueled a powerful crescendo of justice. The quiet woman who had been pushed aside was no longer invisible. She was the catalyst for change, the voice of those who had been silenced for too long. The tension in the air was electric, the stakes higher than ever. This was not just a personal victory, but a reckoning for an entire culture of corruption and deceit. As Greg's downfall became inevitable, Olivia's fate followed swiftly. Stripped of her position and facing mounting scrutiny, she retreated into silence, a shadow of the confident woman who had once mocked Charlotte openly. The hypocrisy she embodied was laid bare, her complicity no longer hidden behind a polished smile. Meanwhile, Charlotte's colleagues began to rally around her, their respect and support a stark contrast to the isolation she had endured. The office transformed into a place of cautious optimism, a fragile hope that integrity could be restored. Yet beneath the surface, the wounds of betrayal still ran deep, reminders of the long and painful journey. Amidst the chaos, Charlotte found herself reflecting on the path she had taken. Revenge had started as a burning need to right personal wrongs, but it had evolved into a fight for justice far greater than herself. The emotional pain she had endured was now a source of strength. Her humiliation transformed into a powerful narrative of resilience. Yet she knew that the battle was not over. Those who had been exposed would not disappear quietly. They would seek to reclaim their power, to rewrite the story, to silence her once more. The climax was near, but the consequences remained uncertain. As the company faced its reckoning, Charlotte stood at the precipice of a new chapter. The air was thick with unresolved tension, the promise of justice hanging in the balance. She knew that the final blow had yet to be struck, that the true test of her strength and resolve was still ahead. The scene was set for a dramatic conclusion, one that would determine not only her fate, but the future of everyone entwined in the web of deceit. The question lingered: would justice prevail, or would the shadows of hypocrisy cast a longer darkness? Charlotte's quiet retaliation had become a storm, and now all that remained was to unleash it. The morning of the final board meeting arrived like the calm before a storm. Charlotte entered the sleek conference room with a steady heart, aware that everything hung in the balance. The company's future, her own reputation, and the fragile hope for true change rested on what was about to unfold. The room was charged with a tense silence, the faces around her a mix of anticipation, fear, and defiance. Greg Harrison sat at the far end, his presence a shadow of the man he once was, no longer the untouchable power broker, but a desperate figure clinging to fading influence. Olivia was absent, her fall from grace complete. Charlotte's evidence, painstakingly gathered and confirmed, formed the backbone of the proceedings. The board members listened as she calmly detailed the web of corruption, bribery, and betrayal that had poisoned the company. Her voice was clear, unwavering, carrying the weight of truth that no one could deny. When she finished, the room remained silent for a moment, then the floodgates opened. Questions, accusations, and confessions erupted, the carefully constructed facade of deceit collapsing under the pressure. Charlotte felt the surge of vindication wash over her, but she remained composed, knowing this was only the beginning. The board voted unanimously to remove Greg from all positions and to initiate a full overhaul of company leadership and policies. Measures were set in motion to restore transparency and to support the employees who had suffered in silence for too long. Charlotte was offered a position on the newly formed Ethics Committee, a recognition not just of her courage, but of the change she embodied. As the meeting adjourned, colleagues approached her with gratitude and respect, their eyes reflecting the relief and hope that had been absent for so long. The humiliation and pain she had endured were being transformed into a legacy of justice. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Charlotte knew the road ahead would be challenging. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and rebuilding trust within the company and herself would take time. There would be those who resented the upheaval, who sought to undermine the new order. But for the first time in years, Charlotte felt the weight of her past begin to lift, replaced by a quiet strength rooted in resilience and purpose. She had turned humiliation into power, betrayal into resolve, and silence into a roar that could not be ignored. As she left the building that afternoon, the English sun breaking through the gray clouds, Charlotte paused and took a deep breath. The journey had been long and painful, marked by shadows and whispered doubts, but she had emerged stronger, unbowed. The question that had haunted her, the fear that justice might never come, had been answered. Revenge had led her to justice, exposing hypocrisy and demanding accountability. But more than that, it had given her back her voice, and with that voice, Charlotte Reed was ready to face whatever came next.